Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Podcast. I'm with the entire team today. So there's Murray Dahm, and there's Mark DeSantis, Lindsay Powell, Myke Cole, and Mark McCaffrey. And of course, everything is being recorded by our technical guru, Angus Wallace. And my name is Jasper Orthuis. I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine. Thank you for joining us and all that. And today we are going to talk about fighting generals, not just generals who are on the battlefield commanding their troops, but who actually take to the front line and show their men how to fight and possibly die. And I'm sure there's a lot of thoughts about that in the team. So I'm just gonna we have a few questions, but I'll just throw those in later if the conversation ever stalls, which I think is very unlikely. I'm just going to give it to Myke because he said he had something to say, and we'll see. Everybody else can politely jump in when they feel like.
So when I wrote Legion versus Phalanx, one of the things, and of course I want to emphasize that my thinking has evolved a lot since then. I think one of the things, unfortunate things about being a historian is you put things in words and then you continue to study and learn and you change your mind and your book is still out there with those things in words. So what are you going to do? So one of the things I posited there is that I saw Hellenistic generals. Now, obviously, the most famous of these being Alexander the Great, right? Operating as tactical units on the battlefield. We see Philip V doing this. We see Antiochus the Great doing this. We see Pyrrhus doing this in the battles that I examined for that book. And while we certainly see Roman consuls doing something similar, I mean, look, we can't deny the spolio pima, right? That is definitely an award designed to incentivize a Roman commander to go out there and mix it up directly with the enemy. And of course, we have Caesar's, although it's much later, example of grabbing a shield and standing in the line, I think against the Nervi, if I'm correct, when that went down. And one of the things that I posited in my conclusions, which I would love to interrogate, is that part of the advantage of the legionary manipular system was this fact that the Romans, by and large, the Roman consuls had a culture of commanding from behind the line and not being expected to engage, usually at the head of the agemma or the head of their hetairoi unit as a tactical unit. The sort of phalanx famously fixing the enemy in place, and then the cavalry, driving in for the knockout blow. So, and then that made me think of a larger question. Okay, so then we see an arc in warfare, right? Certainly even into the medieval world, kings are mixing it up on the battlefield, right? We certainly see that. But is it true that we see a decline in that this idea that the monarch or the general has to be a personal tactical participant in the battle is an archaic concept, and that over time that erodes and changes? Do we have evidence to support that? Is that conclusion correct? I certainly think, we can make that inarguably for Homeric modes of warfare. But we still see it, anytime I try to think of it as a theory and map it across history, I find these troubling spots of no, there they are fighting again. So how do we tackle that question? And does anyone have any thoughts about what the answer is? And what are the best ways to dig in hooks and interrogate it?
I think there will always be exceptions. I think as soon as you make a pigeonholed rule, there will be someone who breaks it. And I think that you can see that in the ancient world and you can see that in the modern world. And I think that the whole idea of the fighting general or the soldiers general is still with us. You can see it right today that there are still soldiers generals and there are still generals who fight from desks, shall we say. And I think there's probably been similar patterns of ancient generalship going all the way back, and almost to the point of you have fighting generals in the Roman world and the Greek world who know how to fight and who know how to win battles. You also have generals who are telling their soldiers to fight and to move forward and, disastrously lose battles. Technically, they're the same kind of general, but the ones that we try to emphasize are the ones who win, not the ones who lose. But I think that there are sort of models of warfare where the expectation of the general fighting and knowing how to fight and being in the front line that's the model. And if you've got it in Homeric warfare, you've got it in the development of hoplite warfare. You lose it in Hellenistic warfare under Alexander because he's not with the infantry, he is with the cavalry. Whereas it does look as though Philip II fights with the infantry. That whole old-fashioned division between an infantry general and a cavalry general. Alexander is leading literally from the front of his companion cavalry, and that then becomes a model that others are expected to follow too. And interestingly, they of course move to the cavalry. When you look at all these Hellenistic generals, they're fighting with their cavalry, not with their infantry, and their infantry are doing the job that they know how to do in the phalanx. Then you've got the Roman generals who are, in a phalanx to start with, or a war band, which begins with them leading. I'm up to date. Against, in their gentilicular, my new word, gentilicular. What a great word. And then, as that evolves, it's almost like the general in the Roman army starts to fall back from the front line to behind to all the way at the back. But then, as you say, there are these examples of Roman generals in the front lines, normally to motivate their troops. But then by the Dark Ages, you've got generals being in the front line of the field wall again, and knowing how to fight, all the way through to what battle is it where is it Charles the Blind gets led? Is it Agincourt or Cressy or one of those 100 Years' War? He gets killed, but he's blind and he wants to fight in a battle blind. So he goes forward and is swinging his sword around with, some minders, which just sounds ridiculous. But anyway, so there is this idea of showing how to do the stuff that you're asking your troops to do. And it sort of comes back to that old meme of, follow me, go there, models of leadership. And each model of leadership can be effective. But again, I think the thing is that we tend to want to emphasize the victors rather than the losers of people who follow those patterns.
So can I get technical? And actually, so the word that we're using is general, and I feel very uneasy using general because that sort of conjures up people with scrambled eggs and flat hats and all the rest of it. Very modern things with all these medals on their pectorals. And so in an ancient battle context, what do we mean by general?
I think that we mean that what we're talking about in this episode is the supreme commander on the field.
But that changes as well, depending on who you're talking about. Like all the examples that Mike's just given.
Whoever leads the army on the battlefield, that guy.
But they've got totally different, totally different motives as such. Because if you're talking about one of the legates going forward for in the Augustan period, then he's got a totally different set of motives to actually being there in the front line compared to a late republic, pro-praetor, pro-consul, warlord, but still, I'm going with they're there for a political reason.
Yeah, but that's what I was going to ask is, you can think of very many different motivations for the general to do that. One is to, like Caesar's example, is to shore up, flagging morale, show that the general is there, and that might be following example. I was thinking actually what Murray said about Roman generals falling back. There's an argument being made that early Roman, the maniple system comes from small, really separate war bands fighting together under their own leader, and that leader later becomes the centurion or somebody like that. And then you just have one person who somehow nominally is in control of all those little war bands and therefore separate from them. And so he stands back. While in a Greek phalanx, the commander is part of that community that makes up the phalanx or the alliance, maybe. But he's the king. But he doesn't start out doing that as a king. So it probably has to do with cultural norms. I mean, Alexander comes from a different cultural background.
Once Alexander was committed, he could no longer direct his troops on any other part of the field. In fact, he would not have known what's going on. In fact, at the Battle of Gaugamela in 334 BC, he had to be called back from his pursuit of Darius, who was already fleeing the field, because Parmenio's left wing on the other side of the battlefield was hard pressed. And so once you're actually committed, if you're a general, you're really only the leader of whatever troops are within vision and you can send orders to. A Roman general in the sense of what we might have seen in, say, Caesar's time or afterward, who is actually further back, it can potentially survey the whole field, see what's going on, send in troops at a certain time. But that itself, I think, is maybe the Romans were able to take their general back from the front lines. And I'm not saying this is the only reason, but maybe this is a good reason, that because the subdivision of the Roman army, whether it was from the legion to the cohorts, maniples, or whatever, centuries, you were able to rely on much lower ranking leaders, if you want to call them officers, centurions, to do the right thing, and follow orders.
That sounds like the same system, really. I mean, if you think about like a Roman concilium happening before a battle, where you've got the pinpointing where the emphasis needs to be upon in the battle, who are you going to actually allocate to that? It sounds like the same thing as Alexander saying to Parmenio, you're going to hold that flank, and I'm actually going to go to where the crux of the battle is really going to be held. So therefore, it sounds like a similar process.
We could get stray completely from this discussion and wonder how much influence on the actual battle tactics does an ancient general really have? I mean, once the battle is underway, to what degree is he able to shift forces to exploit an opportunity?
Well, I think with Alexander, it's an interesting one that both marks make, because on the one hand, the thing that's admirable about Gaugamela is that someone from the Parmenio's left can get to Alexander to tell him, come back. In most battles, there is no system where that can happen. It's just set things in motion and off they go. And I think the interesting thing about the taxace of the phalanx in Macedonian warfare, they're officered by men of the same region of where the phalanx is enlisted. And we don't get the names of all of them, but we know, for instance, we have Elymotus, and we know that the officers come from Elymotus, so they are commanding their own men. So in a way, it's very similar to the later Roman system of a warband and things like that. But they also know what they're doing. So when you look at the six commanders of the six taxace of the phalanx, they are generals in their own right, and they become the successors of, they generally go through a process of being promoted into the companions, getting closer to the king. And then when Alexander dies, those are the men who basically say, now I'm the commander. They've all come through the infantry, and they've all commanded a taxace, and they can be trusted, as Parmenio can, to do what needs to be done. But at the same time, when Alexander does make his charge for Darius, he says, I will take the Hypastists with me and one taxace from the phalanx. We will all go in. And that's the sort of the companion cavalry, the Hypaspists, and one taxace of the phalanx. Now, we assume that the phalanx doesn't split 1/6 of it off and go charging off independently, but that the way that the phalanx maneuvers, it basically becomes like an accordion and it advances echelon to the right so that they stay in contact with one another, which is remarkable on-field battle logistics happening. This is what's going to happen. And that seems to be communicated not before the battle, but mid-battle, which again is how do they say? And we know there are shouted commands. We know that there are flag commands in the Macedonian Hellenistic system, and the fact that they can be followed is remarkable. But I think that other battles very much are set things in motion, and whatever happens, happens.
I was going to say, Murray, I think it's interesting that having been a reenactor with the Emissary Guard, it's when we're a small group of people, like 30 members or whatever, so it's barely a century. And what's interesting is that just the noise of this group of men in metal and wood moving, right, that's deafening. So you really do pay attention to the sound of a horn, to the standard, because you are looking for direction. If they tilt the standard to one side, then you go, okay, we're going left, and so on. And it's amazing. I think this is where this element of discipline comes in. So I think Mark's point, which is right. I mean, there's this kind of the legate is the guy, and I think in modern terms, is it called mission command, where effectively everybody understands what their role is, and if they become disconnected, they still have their mission to fulfill. And and therefore, if you have discipline, you can actually execute that quite well. It's when you don't have the discipline, it falls apart and then it's rabble.
Yeah. I want to say something about the classical hoplite phalanx, but Lindsay, Jasper, you had an argument.
No, I was just going to say, in those situations where everything is agreed beforehand, and or your subordinate commanders know what they're doing, it almost makes sense for the general to just figure out, like Alexander, where is the Schwerpunkt of my attack? Where is it most important place on the battlefield for me to be? Because I am not going to be able to, I can find a hill and go stand on it and then look important, and that's it. But I can be at the decisive point of the battle and motivate my troops and pull them through. And if I die, then we lose anyway.
Do we see a potential change in the nature of martial culture? So, for example, what we might have seen in the Macedonians with Alexander, and then from the Romans as the Roman Republic wore on, and you started seeing a general slowly, but surely, like, pulling back from the field. Perhaps the idea of the fighting general, at least among the Romans, was not as necessary. Perhaps Alexander had to lead from the front. Maybe the idea that he didn't.
The other thing that's interesting for me, for Lindsay's point, if you take Xerxes, he sets up a throne to watch the battle because his subordinates should know what they're meant to do. And so he is very much this model of, I can react, I can send in the immortals when they're required. And yet, because of the emphasis on who wins and what wins, what model wins, that's somehow seen as a corrupt and debased model of leadership. Whereas it's actually what becomes more common later when you're emphasizing different things as a historian. So it's interesting that the model of Persian leadership is this very much detached, let my subordinates do what they need to, but don't, woe betide you if you lose.
Well, hold on. Are we when we say that, are we falling into the Herodotus trap on that? Like, think of Xerxes' own words. When it comes to spears, I am a good spearman. When it comes to bows, I am a good archer. Like he as a king feels it necessary to emphasize. That's in the Persepolis inscription, I believe. To emphasize his fighting virtus the same as a Greek would, I think.
Is that not like Tiberius in terms of, he's a great out in the field during his early career and whatnot, and as soon as he gets into power, it's take a back seat. He doesn't belong out there anymore. Is that what Xerxes is has done as such?
I think the interesting thing is, of course, that's emphasized, and it's still emphasized, and we still see the patterns today of a general who's willing to, sleep under the same stars, experience the same heat, eat the same food. That goes all the way back to 5th century BC. Interestingly, when you start to look at the, that Persian model, that they're all archers. That's what they're trained to do from birth. They're all spearmen, and tell the truth. We're much less clear on that last one. But the interesting thing is that the Greek manuals from Xenophon onwards are, be better than your men at what you're asking your men to do. And the cavalry commander, he says, be better at throwing your javelin from horseback than the men are, so that you can tell them, do this. And that's still a management model today of mostly from self-made businessmen who know how to do every process in their business. So when they hire someone, they can show them how to do it. That's not the same model for everybody. There are different management schemes and things around. But I think the interesting thing from an ancient warfare perspective is you get that assumption that the king is a great spearman and archer. And in Greek and Roman culture, but you need to demonstrate that you are. I'm not just going to take your word for it. You need to show me, which is coming back to your virtus, and show that you can do it kind of argument, rather than we will just assume that you're a brilliant archer.
I mean, the archery and the fighting capability of the Persians, arguably, isn't that just a tradition? I mean, if you look back on the inscriptions from the Assyrians and Babylonians, it's exactly the same. It's the king showing his prowess against lions and bears. And
can I take up the point that Mark made there about Tiberius, because that's the man I'm studying right now, and I feel a great wrong has been done to Tiberius. But the point I want to make was this: I think you're absolutely right. He was a great field commander, and very much, I think, a man engaged in warfare in all its manifest ways. So he was aware of logistics. He was aware of the need to motivate people on the field. He ran carriages around taking wounded soldiers off the battlefield. So he was very much a soldier's soldier. To your point where you're saying that when he became emperor, princeps, he sort of, in a sense, sort of backed off. I would like to couch it in these terms. I think that what he had inherited from Augustus was effectively a policy directive which said no more wars of choice, no more wars of necessity. Keep the empire within its mountains and within its rivers. Keep it as it is. The reality is, when you look at the historical record, there were wars actually all the way through his reign. The difference is this, that because he was a soldier, as he had operated, as you've said earlier, a legate to Augustus, he expected his legionary legates to act as legates to him. So he did not need to be in the front directing these things. And of course, there's also the Sejanus, the Sejanus character, who was about 13, 14 years acting as a. So what I'm saying is that he relied on his experts. I think somebody was just talking about this. If you know to do the job, you go do the job. You don't need me to tell you how to do it. That's why I employ you. So I think what it means is that Tiberius had a very firm idea of foreign policy and military policy as an execution of that. And rather than tinker and micromanage, which he must have no doubt had from Augustus periodically, and you see that in the letters from Suetonius that they're recorded, where he's praising him for his things, but can you move it on a little bit faster, and so on and so forth. There are interesting cases within the Julio-Claudian family. I'm thinking particularly of his brother Nero Claudius Drusus, and then of course his adopted son Germanicus, where they very clearly engaged in frontline warfare. They loved a fisticuff fight. And of course, in the case of Nero Claudius Drusus, it was driven partly by this Claudian idea of the spolia opima, that you would charge into battle because you want to engage the combatant on the other side and literally strip him of his armor, and that would be the prize. You take that to the temple of Jupiter Feretrius as the highest honor, even higher than a triumph as an honor. And Germanicus does this at the Battle of Angevarian War. And what's interesting is, if you look at the way that the battle plan is described, Germanicus is effectively with the Praetorian cohorts in the middle of all the Achaeas within the various array. And he does that because he's able to survey what's going on. And specifically at Angevarian War, he sees that Arminius has taken off some troops into the forest. He breaks ranks with his Praetorian cohorts, and he goes off chasing after them. So I think that you've got there an example where you've got some traditions playing, which is this spolia opima thing, and a natural competitiveness, which is in the sort of the Roman ranks of the families at that sort of time. And that's what a good leader does. He takes the initiative. He sees opportunity, goes after it.
What about the risks? I mean, we have a few questions, and one of them from Matt, who's one of our patrons. He says, and we've discussed the advantage for the general to do this, to show his, to show his virtus, and to get his place in the competition for rank and favors. But what about the risks? We've not mentioned that. What happens?
Canaxa, right? That would have been, ostensibly it would have been the usurper's victory if he hadn't gotten himself killed. And I think that there are probably plenty more examples like that. I think some of it depends on the degree of abstraction from the fighting cohort to what entity. I think when that loyalty is vested in the personhood of a monarch, as is the case of Canaxa, or in the personhood of a charismatic general, with the death of that person, another example is Heraclea, right? Pyrrhus is putting his armor on Megacles, and then that almost cost them the battle, right? Because Megacles is killed, and he has to prove, no, actually, it wasn't him. It wasn't me who fell. There are examples like that. But I bet, I can't think of any across the top of my head, but I bet that maybe we can think of other ones where the death of a commander didn't sound the end, the collapse of the army. But that is an obvious risk, right? It's a complete collapse in the fighting forces' morale.
Well, one danger I can envision of having a general actually taking direct part in a battle, it's Raphia 217 BC. Antiochus III drives off the enemy Ptolemaic left wing and pursues them miles off of the battlefield, and turns around, sees the dust cloud, and says, "What is going on with the phalanx at the rest of the battle?" And they turn around. By the time they get there, the Seleucids have been defeated. So he just took himself out of the fight by chasing the Ptolemies. And so a fighting general who isn't there to see what else is going on can be problematic. And that is the difficulty of having a general who, and also I should bring out that in Hellenistic warfare, at least, that these battlefields could sometimes stretch out for miles if you consider how far a pursuit might be. Just the idea that they rode so far away. At what point did Antiochus, he might have said, you know, we've been gone for 15 minutes. That's a long time to be away from the actual battle. And so, or at least the rest of the army. So that is a big problem.
To add to your point, Mark, to your exact point, is Salacia, 222 BC, is Cleomenes holding the Spartan right, can't see what's going on his left. And so he's actually given false report that his brother is holding fast, and he isn't. And it isn't until Cleomenes drives Antigonus's troops back far enough that he has a view and actually walked the battlefield. I wrote a blog post on this for Osprey. Walked the battlefield and walked his sight line, and you come across a ridge, and you can see what's happening on the left hand of the battlefield. And I think that it makes your point brilliantly. He was able to be tricked because he couldn't have eyes everywhere because he was busy fighting.
Well, the Battle of Delium, where the Athenian right wins, the Athenian left loses to the so far that they don't realize when reinforcements come that they have to flee. So I think there's all sorts of interesting ones like that where commanders don't know what's going on and lead their army into destruction. The Emperor Valens at the Battle of Adrianople. And depending on the report, some say he's not on the battlefield. He's hiding in a farmstead that gets burned. Others that he realizes what's going on and he deliberately goes forward to meet his death, knowing that it's all been lost and he therefore needs to die on the battlefield in order to save some kind of face. Which of course you get multiple times throughout military history as well, which is a kind of weird sacrifice of, I've really stuffed up, I better die here. Better that I die here than that I survive this complete disaster. And Julian, the Emperor Julian in the 360s, again, there's this model of being at the front to their absolute detriment. But it's a funny one. The number of times that you find in military history of someone claiming to have killed the enemy commander. I'm thinking of a medieval example where an Englishman claims to have decapitated the Scottish king at the Battle of the Standard, and it shows the head going, here it is, and then the king takes off his helmet, goes, no, it's not me. But unfortunately, the damage is already done, and the army's in retreat. So it's
not to bust out of our period, but I just wanted to actually bring up. I think that actually that happened at the Battle of Hastings, where William had to actually display his face to the rest of his troops to show that he hadn't actually died, because there was, I guess, some sort of rumor going around that he had been slain. So anyway,
which comes back to Lindsay's point that in the confusion of battle, taking your helmet off and showing your face is effective. It's not like, I don't know who you are, we're in the middle of combat, stop it, just let me fight. That's not happening.
In fact, that's exactly what Germanicus does that, I think, at the Battle of Edessa, if I've got correct. And in fact, the interesting thing, a corollary is true, that Arminius is spotted. And from what I recall, I'm going off memory here, I think he daubs his face in blood, so he's not recognized and escapes. So you've got a very interesting, of course, it may be part of a trope, the cowardly enemy, and of course, this heroic virtus showing this courage.
Yeah, even Alexander, even Alexander not wearing a helmet, and other generals not wearing helmets is a way of being visible.
But it all depends on the circumstance, because if you go to Eumenes takes out that measure of saying, right, if my Macedonian troops see Craterus on the battlefield, I've had it, because their loyalty will be to him. So therefore, the battlefield's big enough, or the terrain is fitting enough, that I can actually put them on one side of the battlefield, have my Cappadocian cavalry charge like mad and block him, and nobody's going to see his Calzia hat falling on that side of the battlefield. So it all depends on the circumstance, doesn't it?
I just wonder, at the end of the core of this ultimately is the personality of the general, isn't it? So, for example, if the person is inclined to bravado and recklessness, but just in a sense gets a thrill out of it, doesn't matter what the culture says, he's going to go and lead from the front because that's where he feels comfortable doing it. And I'm using as my example again. Sorry, my period is Augustus. So Caesar Augustus actually, for his early part of his career, actually from time to time was a frontline battle commander. Right. So, for example, when he was in the Illyrian campaign, 35-36 BC, there's a scene where, in fact, he's actually at a siege. He sees his men falling back. So he rushes out in front, apparently. He actually gets wounded, as it turns out. He gets, I think, a wound to his leg. Similarly, when he is actually in the Iberian Peninsula, in the Cantabrian War in the mid-20s BC, and at a certain point, he goes down, we think it's with typhoid. And at that point, he decides, from now on, my legates will fight for me. I will never actually fight on the battlefield again. And it's a very, very smart thing to do because one, he could have been killed and the whole edifice would have collapsed. But the thing is also, he's very good at picking very good generals. The trouble is, and I think this is a point that you were making very early, Mark, was the fact is that the information doesn't tell us how his legates fought. They may well have also been frontline commanders, but we have no idea. We actually don't know many of their names. So I think I fall back on this basic position. If you feel like you're a Julius Caesar, you're going to lead from the front anyway, because that's what you want to do and that's what you're comfortable at. Other people, they're not going to do that.
It's true you mentioned that because the Battle of the Sombra in 57 BC against the Nervii, where Caesar plucks up a shield and starts reordering all of the legionaries wherever they are on the battlefield because it's a very irregular series of lines. It's not a proper battle in the Roman context. Caesar makes mention of how badly the fourth cohort of the 10th Legion had been hurt, and he makes mention of the very bad wounding of a chief centurion of the fourth cohort of the Legion, rather. But then he doesn't make mention of any other higher ranking officer, that is, who was the legionary commander of the 10th. He doesn't. So, and what were they doing? Presumably they were around, but yes, it's difficult to know because the sources are written with a particular point of view, and you get Caesar's version of it. And when you look at Alexander, they tell you a lot about what Alexander is doing. But surely there were other people on the field handling a lot of things too. I think that the point that Bear is repeating is that a fighting general, once engaged, is vulnerable to all of the weapons of the enemy, and the range of his command and control diminishes the closer he gets to the enemy. And that, I think, is why the Romans, at least during the High Empire, typically relied on a general in the rear. And that's why, for instance, even in the early 3rd century AD, it was remarkable that Emperor Maximinus Thrax actually fought in the front rank as an emperor. That is remarked upon.
That's comes down to personality in terms of Maximinus Thrax. Is he makes his entire career on the fact that he is the soldier's soldier, and therefore, it would be political suicide for him to make that step back at having put that platform forward.
I wonder whether some of the we talk about the personality of the general. I think one of the things that's interesting is it's a performative thing. Your example of Eumenes, very much the idea of, I know how this is going to go, therefore I need to be this for my men to be the general they need me to be. That's not who I am, actually. That it's who I'm required to be in that context. And we get that, again, throughout military history. And I think it's an interesting one. But the interesting thing about the lack of control, the more engaged you get, when you start to look at the hoplite phalanxes, and we've got examples at Marathon where we do get talk of the strategoi, what they did. So we get Callimachus, we get what happened to Callimachus, what happened to I forget his name, Aeschylus's brother. Come on, brain. The other one who dies at the ships getting his hand chopped off. Oh, come on, brain. Anyway, and then even anecdotally we get stories of Epaminondas at Leuctra within the Theban phalanx, presumably close to the front, going, please give me one more step and that will take us to victory. So there is the apothegmata tradition of pithy statements on the battlefield, like it's a witty repartee between lines. And even at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, there's apparently a witty repartee on the battlefield between the Athenian general and Philip. in mid ranks, which again, sort of for that example to exist, tells us they must have been within yelling distance of each other to be able to go, aha, you're in retreat. Yes, I've retreated to victory. You know, you're like, oh, brilliant comment. Wait, feel that burn. And then they advance and defeat the Athenians. But, you know, at Epaminondas, not Epaminondas, Pelopidas also leads the sacred band from the front in person. So there's almost a system in place in some of those warfares where the trust is not just of the general to do what's required, of the individual man. You know, you've done your training, we've gone through this is what we do. And in some cases, it's very straightforward. If you're moving forward, we're winning. You know, and again, at the Battle of Cannae, that's what Hannibal uses to his great advantage. If they're moving forward, they think they're winning. Let's make them lose. I think that also happens at Chaeronea. But there's an interesting problem there that you can play against that. They're going to come forward at us. They're going to want to show how much of a warrior they are. Let's surround them and kill them. So
we talked about this a little bit already, because I want to just jump in on what Murray said, because it all supposes that the other soldiers can see and know who the general is. Because we had some examples of, lifting the helmet and going, see, it's me under here. But that suggests that under the helmet or the armor, like for Megacles and Pyrrhus's armor, the armor is recognizable. Do we have more examples of that? How they might have recognized
Julius Caesar's famous red cloak,
where he is? Yeah, but how do you, if he's in the front line, 10 guys around him can see that.
I'm assuming the general's on a horse.
And the battlefield might be a mile wide, though, and very difficult for someone in ranks further down to see. It is one important question that arises is just what did the typical soldier see in a battle? Are we just more or less telling the story of, well, this is what was happening around the general at the time, the supreme commander, and maybe a few things happening on the wings, but the typical soldier was not aware of a lot of these events. And I think that the typical soldier was not aware. That is, in many cases, they may have thought that they won the battle and the army.
But you mentioned Caesar mentioning his centurions, and Caesar always makes a point of emphasizing the role of his centurions. And it's been posited that they also play a role in this. If Caesar has a connection to his centurions, they might know where he's going to be, what he's going to do. And they then tell their soldiers, hey, look, the general is right there. Let's,
So this goes back to the point. I mean, between Mark and I think we were sort of developing this idea. So, for example, in a sort of mission form of combat doctrine, I mean, everybody is aware of what the end goal is, and they're empowered at a certain level to act in ways independently of having to actually ask for permission to do that. I think at the Battle of Pharsalus, isn't there, one of the Centurions actually basically effectively does it, I'm like kind of sees a man, I'm going to charge ahead. The interesting thing I think is really the degree to which to develop the other Mark's point, Mark DeSantis, having been a reenactor of the early Principate, that you cannot see very much when you have an Imperial Gallic G helmet. I mean, literally, you get this sort of curvature around the eyes, and you can see a little bit to the right, to the left. Okay, you can hear sort of above the din between the metal plates of your armor and the shouting, right? And of course, if you're trotting and then racing, I mean, this is a cacophony of noise. You really have limited edition. We come back to the older adage of you're fighting with your brothers on either side of you. You're relying on them to hold a formation, to actually do what they're told to do. And of course, if you're actually within eyesight of the centurion with his transverse crest, I mean, he's going to be waving his vine stick or whatever he's doing, in order to give directions. But I think, again, we come back to this idea that it's discipline. The man is required to do a certain number of things. He's drilled, he's trained, just do it.
I think it's interesting because we get lots of battle accounts where rumors spread through an army mid-battle, normally about the commander being dead. And you're like, well, hang on, how did that rumor spread? Is it yelling that's being heard, that's being passed on, that's deliberate? And it's a very tricky thing because, do you become hypersensitive in a battle to a vine stick, to a transverse crest, to an identifiable helmet? Having mentioned the Alexander not wearing a helmet. You know, he does have a very distinctive helmet when he bothers to wear it. And we've got, you know, other helmets. I mean, you mentioned, Mark, the one Craterus's helmet. So clearly there are things that, you know, and obviously famously you've got Patroclus wearing Achilles' armor, which I think is something that, is it a literary trope? What Pyrrhus does with Megacles, you're like, hang on, there's a very Trojan War example that you're following here. But that clearly these things do work on a battlefield. You can tell individuals, you can tell units, you know, and again,
might said something about, you know, we're assuming now that this battle is constantly ongoing, and you know, we've had lots of debate about that. Is it constant fighting, or is it, you know, bursts, and then maybe, you know, if there's one of those breaks every so many minutes between fighting, that's a good time for a rumor to go, I saw the general go down. And well, you know, and a shock like that, that's an important piece of news that will go around quickly.
I was going to say that again, for example, if again, Roman period is the one I know best. I mean, that you're just, you know, you've got the centuries, you've got the cohorts of those, and really that there's space between these units fighting. So I would imagine that the news would spread across that block of men, right, who are doing whatever they're doing. And of course, then it needs to transmit across to another cohort of century and able to do it. And I don't frankly know how that happens. Again, from my reenactment experience, when you're engaged in doing what you're doing, that's what you're concentrating on. Because if you don't concentrate, you run the risk of being killed or injured. That's kind of how it works.
I was just going to go on what Murray was saying about in terms of identifying leaders on the battlefield, etc. You've got, you know, again, going to the battle where Craterus dies, you've got Eumenes going across the battlefield looking for, oh God, who is it? I can't remember his name. It's gone from my mind. But yes, you've got, you know, it's not the only time that you've got people trying to seek out enemy commanders across a battlefield. You do get the sort of sense that this is perfectly a, you know, legitimate course of action, that you can identify enemy commanders or, you know, enemy personnel by particular identifying marks.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing is, of course, that we've got several battles where almost accidentally the enemy general gets killed. You know, not. It would be hard to say that they're being targeted. You know, again, the Thebans deliberately pack their left, which is unusual, knowing that they're going to be facing the Spartans on the right, knowing that the position of the Spartan king is in the middle of the leftmost lokos of the Spartan army. So it's kind of like, well, hang on, we know where they are. Let's go and fight them. So there is that kind of evidence that you know, they know their enemy. So therefore, we know that the enemy general is going to be on the rightmost flank of their phalanx, in the front line when it comes to hoplite battle. Therefore, let's go there. And peculiarly for most of hoplite warfare, of course, they don't. It's like, no, we're going to be on the most honorable position on our own line, on the right flank, in the middle. You're like, so hang on, we're going to be fighting, you know, right versus left, which happens for a lot of hoplite warfare. And so there is that kind of idea of knowing where your enemy general was. And again, Myke's example of Cunaxa, the same thing happens. You've got Cyrus targeting Artaxerxes in that battle, and it coming off badly for him. Even though, again, there's rumors that he wounds Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes is carried from the battlefield. And the funny thing about that is, of course, we know that from Ctesias, who's his doctor, which is like, wow, that's pretty cool. But the rumor is not Artaxerxes is dead. There's not this kind of like, well, he's wounded, he's carried from the battlefield, he's being tended behind the lines. That doesn't then spread a rumor through the Persian battle that he's dead. It's almost must have been, you know, systems in place to stop that rumor or to spread a counter rumor. No, he's not dead. No. Just fight, do what you're doing. I don't know why I chose to do a British accent for that, but the good old Sergeant Major.
That seems to have killed the discussion. Oh, Mario, what did you do?
Bang on 48 minutes. That's like perfect.
Exactly. Well, on that bombshell. Myke has already left us, and I think we'll leave it at that and see you again in a month. Thank you very much.